At some point in life, many intelligent men notice something quietly troubling inside themselves, a constant inner pressure that does not disappear even when life looks reasonably successful from the outside. You may have a stable career, responsibilities fulfilled, and years of effort behind you, yet the mind keeps returning to the same silent question. Why am I still not satisfied with myself? This question rarely appears dramatically. It usually comes in quiet moments when the day slows down and the mind begins reviewing the past almost automatically. Small decisions return first, then larger ones, and slowly the feeling grows that something about your own standards has become unusually strict. And then another thought appears. Why am I so hard on myself? Many intelligent men reach this point not because something is wrong with them, but because their mind has been trained for decades to see what could be improved. The same ability that helped them succeed gradually turns inward. The analytical habit that once solved problems at work begins examining their own life with the same relentless precision. And precision rarely produces satisfaction. When the mind is trained to detect mistakes, it becomes very efficient at finding them. Even small imperfections become visible, and once they are visible, they begin to feel significant. The mind rarely pauses to appreciate what is already working, because its primary function has always been to identify what still needs correction. This is not pessimism. It is simply a highly trained pattern of attention. Earlier in life, this pattern often feels productive. It pushes a man to study harder, work longer, prepare better, and think through consequences that others may overlook. In many situations, this mindset becomes a real advantage. But something changes with time. The same internal system that once improved external results slowly begins evaluating the man himself. Not only his work, but his past decisions, his relationships, his priorities, even the path his life has taken. And the evaluation becomes thorough, very thorough. An intelligent mind rarely looks at events in isolation. It automatically connects causes, consequences, missed opportunities, and alternative scenarios that could have unfolded differently. A single memory can open a chain of reflections stretching across decades. And this process rarely ends with a simple conclusion, because intelligence often carries an uncomfortable companion, awareness of how many different lives could have been lived. The mind quietly builds hypothetical versions of the past. What if I had chosen differently there? What if I had taken that opportunity? What if I had seen earlier what I only understand now? None of these questions are dramatic. They simply linger, and over time, the comparison becomes subtle but constant. The real life that happened stands beside the imagined life that might have been possible, and the imagined version always seems slightly more elegant, slightly more coherent, slightly closer to what the mind now believes would have been wiser. But this comparison contains a hidden distortion. The imagined version of the past contains no uncertainty. It is built using knowledge that only appeared years later. It is a perfect reconstruction, designed by a mind that now sees patterns that were invisible at the time. Real life never had that advantage, yet the mind rarely acknowledges this difference when judging itself. It simply concludes that things could have been done better, and so the internal standard quietly rises. Perfectionism rarely arrives as ambition. More often, it appears as a sense of responsibility toward one's own potential, a feeling that if a man can see clearly, he should also live accordingly. This sounds reasonable, but the human mind was never designed to live entirely under the supervision of its own analytical abilities. The same clarity that reveals possibilities also reveals limitations, contradictions, and trade-offs that cannot be fully resolved. Intelligent men tend to notice these contradictions very early. They see the complexity inside decisions that others treat more simply. They understand that every path closes other paths, and once you see that clearly, self-judgment becomes almost inevitable, because every decision now contains visible alternatives, and every alternative quietly suggests that perhaps something better was possible. Over the years, this creates a peculiar emotional climate inside the mind. Nothing feels entirely wrong, yet nothing feels fully settled either. Life moves forward, but the internal review continues running quietly in the background, like a system that never completely shuts down. Sometimes this review becomes strongest after success rather than failure. When a goal is finally reached, the mind does not always celebrate. Instead, it begins examining the cost of reaching it. Was it worth the time? Was the direction correct? Did I overlook something more meaningful along the way? These questions are not signs of instability. They are signs of an intellect that continues searching for coherence. But coherence is a difficult standard for a real human life. Life rarely unfolds as a perfectly designed structure. It grows more like a landscape shaped by many small decisions, circumstances, responsibilities, and unexpected turns that only make partial sense when viewed from the present moment. Yet the analytical mind prefers clean structures. It likes when everything fits logically into place, and when life refuses to organize itself so neatly, dissatisfaction quietly appears. Not because life failed, but because the mind expected a clearer pattern. Many intelligent men eventually realize something uncomfortable. The same intellect that helped them understand the world now applies the same rigorous logic to themselves. That a human life is not a system that can be optimized indefinitely. It contains emotions, timing, obligations, other people, and unpredictable events that cannot be fully controlled. Even the most thoughtful decisions unfold inside conditions that no mind can fully anticipate. Still, the internal critic rarely accepts this limitation easily. It continues asking whether things could have been handled better. And because intelligence produces many possible answers, the questioning rarely stops. Over time, this creates a quiet sense of tension between two parts of the same mind. One part recognizes that life has been lived with effort, responsibility, and genuine attempts to make good choices. The other part keeps analyzing those same choices as if they were problems waiting to be solved. Both parts are sincere, but they operate according to different principles. The analytical part values precision, improvement, and clarity. The human part simply lived through time, with the information available in each moment. And those two perspectives rarely judge the past in the same way. When this tension remains unrecognized, it can create the strange feeling of never quite measuring up to one's own expectations. Not because the expectations were unreasonable at the time, but because they are constantly being updated by a mind that never stops learning. Every new insight quietly rewrites the standards by which earlier decisions are evaluated. This process is subtle but powerful. The wiser the mind becomes, the more easily it notices what could have been done differently. But wisdom appears later than the decisions it now judges. So the mind is often comparing two versions of itself that never truly existed at the same time. The younger man who acted without today's knowledge, and the older mind that now evaluates those actions with far greater understanding. And the older mind rarely feels generous toward the younger one. Yet that younger man was doing something difficult. He was navigating uncertainty in real time. He did not know how events would unfold. He did not know which risks would succeed or fail. He simply moved forward, using the best reasoning available at that moment. That is how all lives unfold. But intelligence sometimes forgets this basic fact because it prefers retrospective clarity. Looking backward creates the illusion that the correct path should have been obvious all along. Yet at the time, The path rarely appeared that clear. Life looked more like a fog than a map, and decisions were made step by step inside that fog. When this perspective slowly becomes visible, something interesting begins to change inside the mind. The harsh internal voice loses some of its certainty, not because the past suddenly becomes perfect, but because it becomes easier to see the conditions in which those choices were made. And those conditions were never simple. They included responsibilities, pressures, limited information, emotional realities, and the ordinary complexity of living among other people whose lives were also unfolding at the same time. Under those conditions, perfection was never truly available. Only movement was. Intelligent men sometimes spend years evaluating the elegance of their life path. Yet life itself rarely aims for elegance. It moves through compromises, corrections, learning, and occasional moments of clarity that appear only after long periods of uncertainty. Seen from this angle, the strictness many men feel toward themselves begins to look less like a flaw and more like a side effect of awareness. A mind that sees many possibilities naturally imagines better outcomes. A mind that values responsibility naturally wants those outcomes to have been achieved. But the distance between possibility and reality is where every human life unfolds, and that distance cannot be eliminated by intelligence alone. When this becomes quietly understood, the inner atmosphere changes slightly. The questions may still appear. The mind may still review the past, but the tone softens, because the man who once judged himself so strictly begins to see something else in the story of his own life. Not a sequence of imperfect decisions, but a long process of learning how complex a human life actually is. And once that complexity becomes visible, the question, "Why am I so hard on myself?" slowly transforms into a quieter recognition. Perhaps the strictness was never really about failure. Perhaps it was simply the mind trying to understand a life that could never be fully solved.